People say accidents are bound to happen, some insignificant, others life-altering. But when it comes to marriage, should a mere twist of fate determine the course of a lifetime? Some say love is a choice, others believe it's destiny. But what if it's an accident, one that changes everything? Elna and Khalid's love story was never supposed to happen. The Accidental Bride, a love story between a powerful sheikh in Saudi Arabia and a prayerful woman from Africa, is a tale of faith colliding with destiny. Elna was a woman of prayer, a believer who trusted God's leading even when he led her into the unknown. Khalid was a ruler of power and prestige, a man bound by duty, tradition, and a heart that had never truly known love. She never imagined marrying a man like him, and he never expected a woman like her to change everything. But when betrayal, war, and faith intertwine, can love truly conquer all? Let's dive into Elna and Khalid's story. Elna sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers entwined in deep contemplation. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of her bedside lamp, casting elongated shadows across the walls. The hum of the night outside, the distant sound of cars, the occasional bark of a dog, felt like an eerie reminder of how much her life was about to change. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. Lord, if this is the wrong path, close the door, but if it's your will, help me walk through it. The opportunity to work in Riyadh had come unexpectedly. A humanitarian mission helping displaced women and children, an offer that felt like a divine calling. Yet every time she thought about boarding that plane, an invisible force tugged her back. Or maybe, just maybe, that force had a name. Luandile. Her love, her future at least. That's what she had believed for the past 3 years. He had been charming when they met, attentive, the kind of man who could make her laugh with a simple glance. But over time, his charm had morphed into control. His love came with conditions. His presence, though intoxicating, had begun to suffocate her. And now, here she was, caught between love and purpose. A loud knock at her door startled her. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Luandile. Elna hesitated before unlocking the door. The last thing she needed was another argument. As soon as she pulled it open, Luandile stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He was dressed in a crisp black suit, his cologne heavy in the air. His tall frame loomed over her as he scanned the packed suitcase by her bedside. "So you're really going?" he asked, his voice low but laced with tension. Elna sighed, shutting the door behind him. "Luandile, we've talked about this, and I told you it's a mistake." He turned to face her fully, arms crossed. "You're throwing away everything we've built. For what? Some strangers in a foreign country?" "It's not just about them," Elna defended. "It's about what I'm called to do." Luandile scoffed, running a frustrated hand over his neatly trimmed beard. "And what about me, Elna? Have you thought about what this means for us?" She swallowed. "Of course I have." "No, you haven't," he shot back, stepping closer. "Because if you had, you wouldn't be going." Elna took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Luandile, I love you, but I need to do this. I need to be more than just my woman." His tone was sharp. "Is that what you're saying, that being with me isn't enough for you?" The words stung, twisting her resolve. Luandile sighed and softened his tone, reaching for her hands. "Elna, we have a future together. Marriage, a home, children. Don't throw it away for some temporary adventure." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to say yes. But deep in her heart, she knew, if she gave in now, she would spend the rest of her life resenting him. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I have to go." A muscle ticked in Luandile's jaw, his fingers tightening around hers before he abruptly let go. "If you leave, don't expect things to be the same when you come back." Elna's heart clenched, but she nodded. "I understand." Without another word, he turned and walked out. As the door clicked shut behind him, Elna finally let the tears fall. The airport was crowded, the usual mix of travelers, security personnel, and hurried announcements over the intercom. Elna clutched her passport and ticket, her heart still aching from her last conversation with Luandile. "Girl, If you keep looking like that, they might think you're smuggling something, Thandi teased, nudging her with an elbow. Elna forced a laugh. I'm just nervous. Thandi eyed her knowingly. Luan deal? Elna nodded. Her friend sighed. Listen, you know I love you, right? Elna glanced at her. Yes. Then trust me when I say you're making the right choice. Elna exhaled, letting Thandi's words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was the step she needed to take, not just for the women and children she was going to help, but for herself. Boarding pass, please. Elna handed it over to the gate agent, watching as she scanned it. A frown crossed the woman's face. She typed something into her computer before looking back up. One moment, please. Elna's stomach twisted. Was something wrong? The agent quickly recovered, smiled, and handed the ticket back. There was a minor system issue. You're all set. Enjoy your flight. Relieved, Elna walked toward the boarding bridge. She had no idea that she had just stepped into the wrong flight. The moment Elna entered the aircraft, she knew something was off. This was no commercial flight. The seats were plush leather, wider than usual, with golden accents along the armrests. The space was eerily quiet, no bustling passengers, no flight attendants giving safety instructions. Instead, only a handful of people sat, all in tailored suits, conversing in hushed voices. Had she been upgraded to first class? A flight attendant in an elegant uniform approached her. Elna Mthembu? Yes? Please have a seat. Would you like anything to drink? No, thank you. Something wasn't right. She shifted uncomfortably as the aircraft taxied down the runway. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Was she imagining things? Once they were in the air, a man in a dark suit appeared. He walked toward her with an unreadable expression. Miss Mthembu, may I see your passport? Confused, Elna handed it over. The man studied it, then looked at her sharply. You are not supposed to be on this flight. Elna's breath caught. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaking. This is a private jet belonging to Sheikh Khalid Al-Faisal. The name barely registered before two security guards appeared behind him. A cold sweat broke over Elna's skin. There must be a mistake. My ticket... Your ticket was switched at the gate, the man said, his voice impassive. We will need to detain you until this is sorted. Detain? Elna's panic surged. Please, let me call someone. One of the guards snatched her phone before she could finish her sentence. Elna let out a sharp gasp. Her only connection to the outside world gone. Before she could react, the guards flanked her. Stand up, one of them ordered. Terror rooted Elna to the spot. You don't understand, she whispered. This is a mistake. I was supposed to be on a flight to Riyadh for a humanitarian mission. The man in the suit barely blinked. Welcome to Riyadh, Miss Mthembu. Elna's world spun. She was trapped, and no one knew where she was. Elna's pulse hammered in her ears as she was led down a sleek, dimly lit corridor inside the jet. The lavish surroundings did nothing to soothe the raw fear clawing at her chest. She had heard stories, horrifying tales of people who vanished in foreign lands, never to be heard from again. God help me. Sheikh Khalid Al-Faisal. The name echoed in her mind. She knew little about him, but what she had read in passing was enough. He was powerful, untouchable, a ruler whose authority no one dared to question. One of the guards gestured toward a door. Inside. Elna hesitated. Please, A firm hand pressed against her back, guiding her forward. The door shut behind her with a soft but ominous click. The room was spacious, yet intimidating. A large wooden desk stood at the center, and behind it sat a man who radiated quiet authority, Sheikh Khalid Al-Faisal. He was younger than she had expected, likely in his late 30s, with piercing dark eyes that studied her with detached curiosity. For a moment silence hung between them. Then in perfect English he spoke. Miss Mthembu, you are a long way from home. Elna swallowed hard. Your Highness, there's been a mistake. I was supposed to be on a commercial flight to Riyadh. He leaned back, his expression unreadable. Indeed, there has been a mistake, one that should not have happened. Hope flickered in her chest. Then you'll let me go. Sheikh Khalid exhaled, clasping his hands together. That depends. Her breath hitched. On what? On whether I believe you. Elna's knees nearly buckled. Why would I lie about this? The Sheikh's gaze remained steady. You are an unknown woman with no diplomatic ties, and you boarded my private aircraft. Either you are a spy or someone else has orchestrated this situation. Tears burned behind Elna's eyes. I'm not a spy. I'm a social worker from South Africa. I can prove it if you let me call someone. Sheikh Khalid studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he picked up a sleek black phone and made a brief call in Arabic. Moments later, the door opened, and a man in a traditional white thobe stepped inside. Yes, Your Highness. Check her background, Sheikh Khalid instructed. If she is telling the truth, we will arrange for her safe departure. Elna nearly collapsed with relief. Thank you, she whispered. The Sheikh's expression remained impassive. Do not thank me yet, Miss Mathembu. If your story does not check out, I will not be so merciful. Elna's throat tightened. She had never felt more at the mercy of a stranger in her entire life. The opulence of the palace was overwhelming. Elna had expected grandeur, but nothing prepared her for the sheer scale of Sheikh Khalid Al-Faisal's estate. The towering marble pillars, intricate gold filigree on the walls, and expansive chandeliers casting a soft golden glow made the entire palace feel like something out of a dream or a cage, depending on how one looked at it. The guards led her through a maze of corridors, their steps echoing in the silence. The air was cool, scented with oud and jasmine, yet Elna's chest felt tight with uncertainty. Her future was no longer in her hands. Eventually, they stopped before a carved wooden door with delicate inlays of mother-of-pearl. One of the guards pushed it open, revealing a room that was both breathtaking and intimidating. The walls were adorned with intricate geometric patterns, a mixture of deep blues and golds, creating a mesmerizing effect under the soft lighting. A canopy bed, draped in fine silk, stood against one side of the room, its sheets untouched. Large arched windows, framed with heavy velvet curtains, overlooked the city skyline, but the glass was thick-likely reinforced. Elna stepped inside hesitantly. The moment the door closed behind her, she exhaled sharply, the weight of the past few hours finally sinking in. She was in a foreign palace, held under the authority of one of the most powerful men in the Middle East, and she had no idea what he planned to do with her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened, and a maid dressed in a modest abaya entered, her eyes downcast. "Miss, His Highness will see you now." Elna's stomach twisted. There was no escaping this conversation. She straightened her shoulders and took a steadying breath. If she was to face the lion, she would do so with her head held high. Elna barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that cold interrogation room, Sheikh Khalid's piercing gaze stripping her of every layer of security she had ever known. Even now, as she sat in the luxurious suite they had confined her to, she could still hear his voice. "Do not thank me yet, Miss Mathembu. If your story does not check out, I will not be so merciful." A shudder ran down her spine. The morning light crept through the heavy drapes, but it did little to comfort her. She was still in the Sheikh's palace, still a prisoner in this foreign land. She tried to pray, but her words felt hollow. Was this truly God's plan for her? A knock at the door startled her. It opened before she could respond, and two guards stepped in, their faces unreadable. "The Sheikh wants to see you." Elna took a deep breath and followed them down the vast corridors of the palace, the walls adorned with intricate golden designs. The air smelled of expensive oud, the scent strong but oddly soothing. They led her to a grand hall where Sheikh Khalid sat at the head of a long, polished table. The weight of his power was tangible, the kind of presence that made men bow in fear. "Sit," he ordered. Elna obeyed, her hands clasped together in her lap. He leaned forward, his dark eyes watching her every move. "My men have confirmed your identity." Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. "But that does not mean you are innocent," he continued, his voice dangerously low. "You are still a complication I did not ask for." Elna met his gaze. "Then let me go." He scoffed. "If only it were that simple. Do you know how many enemies I have? A foreign woman accidentally boarding my private jet raises too many questions. Questions I cannot afford. Elna swallowed hard. I didn't plan this. I was just trying to follow where I felt God was leading me. At the mention of God, Khalid's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Amusement, contempt, she couldn't tell. You put your faith in a God who allows you to be stranded in a land where you have no power? She straightened her back. I put my faith in a God who directs my steps, even when I don't understand them. Khalid's expression darkened. Then perhaps he should explain why you're here, because I have no use for a woman who prays but cannot prove her worth. Elna clenched her fists under the table, refusing to let his words shake her. Proverbs 16:9 echoed in her mind. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Maybe she didn't know why she was here, but God did. After the tense meeting with Khalid, Elna was finally given her phone back. Her hands trembled as she dialed Luandila's number. It rang once, twice, then silence. Frowning, she tried again. The number you have dialed is not available. Panic rose in her chest. Had something happened to him? Or worse, was he ignoring her? She checked her messages. Nothing. No missed calls, no texts. She tried to dismiss the sinking feeling in her stomach. Luandil was probably busy. Maybe he was waiting for her to call from Riyadh, unaware of the nightmare she had been thrown into. Still, something felt wrong. Later that afternoon, as she was escorted through the palace, Elna stumbled upon a scene that took her by surprise. Two young boys, no older than 8, were throwing a tantrum in the hallway, their nannies desperately trying to calm them down. I don't want to do lessons today, the boy shouted, crossing his arms. You always make us do boring things. The nannies exchanged nervous glances, clearly at a loss. The guards beside Elna shifted uncomfortably. Without thinking, Elna stepped forward. You don't have to like lessons, she said gently, but what if I told you learning can be fun? The children blinked at her, their curiosity piqued. Who are you? The girl asked. Elna smiled. My name is Elna, and I know a secret only smart kids get to hear it. The boy's frown softened. What secret? She leaned down, lowering her voice to a whisper. That learning isn't just about books, it's about stories, adventures. Have you ever heard about the man who built a giant boat because God told him to? Their eyes widened. Like a real boat? The boy asked. A huge one, Elna said, nodding. His name was Noah, and his story is amazing. The children were hooked. The nannies looked stunned, but Elna wasn't surprised. She had always had a way with kids. It was part of why she became a social worker. What did surprise her, however, was the deep voice behind her. You seem to have a gift. She turned to see Sheikh Khalid watching the scene, his arms crossed. Khalid had expected his children to be difficult. Ever since their mother's death, they had become distant, unruly. No amount of discipline had worked. Yet here they were, laughing and listening to a complete stranger. His eyes narrowed. They never listened to their teachers, but they listened to you. Elna met his gaze. Maybe they just needed someone to speak to them with patience. He studied her, his mind racing. She was different, stronger than he had assumed. Dangerously so. That night, Khalid received disturbing news. Someone in his palace had leaked information about the foreign woman in his custody. His enemies were already whispering, eager to use it against him. His advisors gathered in his office, their expressions tense. We must act quickly, one of them insisted. Rumors are spreading. They are painting you as a tyrant who abducts innocent women. Khalid's jaw clenched. What do you suggest? A long pause. Then the eldest advisor spoke. A temporary marriage contract. Silence. Khalid's expression turned to stone. You want me to marry her? If the woman is your wife, then no one can accuse you of wrongdoing. It will silence your enemies. Khalid hated the idea. He did not take orders from anyone, least of all from those who sought to control him. But the alternative was worse. When Khalid told Elna of his decision, she nearly collapsed. A marriage contract? She repeated in disbelief. Temporary, he clarified. A few months, nothing more. It will ensure your safety and it will protect my name. Elna's head spun. This was madness. "I have a life back in South Africa," she whispered. "A fiancé." Khalid's eyes darkened. "Where is this fiancé now? Has he even tried to find you?" The question hit her like a blow. Lwandile hadn't called. He hadn't answered. And she couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't. Still, agreeing to this would be crossing a line she never thought she'd face. "God, what do I do?" A verse came to mind. Isaiah 41:10. "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God." Maybe this was where she was meant to be. After a long silence, she met Khalid's gaze. "I'll do it." That night, as she sat alone in her room, her phone finally buzzed. It was an email from Lwandile. Her heart pounded as she opened it. "Elna, I can't believe you would abandon our future like this. You should have stayed. You should have chosen us." Her hands trembled. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she realized Lwandile wasn't coming for her. She was truly on her own. The sun hung low in the Riyadh sky, casting an amber glow over the vast estate as Elna stood before a towering mirror, her heart heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman caught in a life she had never imagined. The silk fabric of her wedding dress clung to her frame, its ivory sheen gleaming under the golden lights of her suite. The gown was elegant, yet modest, designed to respect the customs of the land she was now bound to. Bound. The word sent a shiver down her spine. This was not a wedding, it was a transaction. Days earlier, when Khalid had presented the proposal, Elna had felt her world tilt. How could she, a woman of faith, consider such a thing? She had spent the entire night in prayer, pacing the confines of her room, begging God for clarity. Her Bible lay open to Proverbs 3:5-6. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." But how could this path possibly be straight? "Father, if this is not your will, show me another way," she whispered into the silence. But no answer came, only the deep, pressing sense that this was the only choice before her. If she refused, she risked being thrown into a situation far worse. If she agreed, she could at least hold on to her dignity, even if it was within the walls of a loveless marriage. And then there was Lwandile. How could she tell him? Would he understand? Or would he see it as the ultimate betrayal? He had always been her rock, the man she once thought she would build a life with. The thought of calling him made her sick with guilt, but leaving him in the dark felt even worse. She had drafted several messages, deleted them all, then finally settled on one simple sentence. "Lwandile, I need to talk to you." But even after sending it, she knew no words would ever be enough to explain what she was about to do. A knock sounded at the door, and a woman entered, a palace attendant draped in a dark abaya. She lowered her gaze and gestured for Elna to follow. "It's time," the woman said softly. Elna's stomach twisted as she stepped forward, her feet feeling as though they carried the weight of an entire world. The ceremony was nothing like the weddings Elna had dreamed of as a child. There were no flowers, no music, no joyous celebrations. Instead, she stood in a quiet, dimly lit chamber inside the palace, facing Sheikh Khalid al-Faisal. He was dressed in a crisp white thobe and a traditional bisht embroidered with gold. His expression remained impassive, his dark eyes betraying no emotion. To him, this was merely a formality, a necessary move to quell the political storm that had erupted since her arrival. The officiant recited the necessary vows in Arabic. Elna's heart pounded in her chest as she repeated the words she barely understood, sealing herself in a marriage that felt more like a prison sentence. When it was over, Khalid turned to her, his voice low and firm. "This changes nothing," he said. "You are my wife in name only. Do not mistake this for something real." Elna met his gaze, her throat tightening. "I never did." The ceremony concluded, and within minutes, the attendants escorted her back to her quarters. There was no wedding night, no celebration, only silence and a growing storm in Elna's heart. Days passed, and Elna found herself adjusting to the rhythm of palace life, though she remained a stranger within its walls. She spent hours in prayer, seeking clarity, seeking peace. The words of Isaiah 41:10 anchored her when the uncertainty became too much. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Yet despite her prayers, Khalid remained a mystery. At times, she would catch him watching her with an unreadable expression, as if trying to decipher her presence in his world. He never spoke of faith, never mentioned God, but Elna sensed something beneath his hardened exterior. A man burdened by the weight of responsibility, a ruler shackled by duty. One evening, as she sat by the palace's ornate garden, whispering a prayer, Khalid approached. "You pray often," he observed, standing a few feet away. Elna looked up, surprised. "Yes, to a God who has allowed you to be trapped in a marriage you never wanted." His voice was edged with skepticism. Elna studied him. "God's ways are not always clear to us, but I trust that he has a purpose, even in this." Khalid's lips twitched as if amused, though his eyes remained cold. "Faith is a strange thing." Elna smiled faintly. To some, a silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then, without another word, Khalid turned and walked away, leaving Elna with a flicker of something unexpected, curiosity. The moment Elna saw Lwandile's name flash on her phone screen, her hands trembled. She hesitated before answering. "You didn't even say goodbye." His voice came through, cold and accusing. Elna swallowed. "Lwandile, You abandoned me, Elna. After everything we planned, do you even care about us anymore?" Elna closed her eyes. How was she supposed to tell him? She had rehearsed different versions of the conversation in her head, trying to soften the truth. But no matter how she framed it, the outcome would be the same. Lwandile would never understand. She had spent days dreading this moment, knowing he would see her choice as betrayal. But was it really betrayal if she was following what she believed to be God's leading? Guilt gnawed at her, but she fought against it. "You know it wasn't like that. I had to come here." A bitter laugh. "Had to or wanted to." Elna closed her eyes. "Lwandile, I need you to understand. I don't need to understand anything," he snapped. "You made your choice, and now you're married to some Arab prince, pretending to be one of them. Do you even hear yourself?" Elna's grip on the phone tightened. "You don't know the full story." "I know enough," he said darkly. "You've changed, Elna, and not for the better." The call ended abruptly, leaving Elna feeling drained and hollow. Lwandile's words clung to her, each one laced with manipulation, designed to make her doubt herself. But this time, something was different. She didn't crumble. Instead, she breathed deeply and turned to the one place where she found true peace. Her knees hit the floor and she prayed. If there was one unexpected comfort in the palace, it was Khalid's children. Elna first met them by accident when she wandered into the palace library one afternoon. Two young boys, no older than 7 and 5, sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, arguing over a book. She smiled, stepping closer. "Which one of you gets to pick the book today?" The older boy, Malik, looked up, his dark eyes wary. "Who are you?" Elna crouched to their level. "I'm Elna." The younger boy, Zaid, frowned. "Are you Baba's prisoner?" Elna's breath caught. "No, I'm a guest." Malik studied her, then held up the book. "Can you read this to us?" Elna hesitated before taking it. It was a collection of folk tales, written in both Arabic and English. Settling beside them, she began to read, her voice soft yet engaging. Minutes turned into an hour, and for the first time since arriving, Elna felt something warm bloom in her chest. She was not alone. From the doorway, Khalid watched the scene unfold. His sons, usually restless and distant, sat captivated by the woman he had been forced to marry. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, and for the first time, Elna saw a glimpse of the man behind the ruthless ruler. The whispers began shortly after the wedding. Foreign newspapers ran sensational headlines. Some accused Khalid of hiding a scandal. Others speculated that Elna was a spy planted by political enemies. The tension within the palace grew. One evening, Khalid stormed into Elna's quarters, his eyes dark with anger. "Have you been speaking to anyone outside the palace?" Elna frowned. "Of course not. Then why are there reports of you being a Western informant?" Elna's heart pounded. "I don't know. I haven't spoken to anyone." Khalid exhaled sharply. "This marriage was meant to fix a problem, not create more. If things get worse, I may have to send you away." Elna stiffened, an unexpected pang of hurt piercing her. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. Khalid hesitated. Then, without answering, he left the room. That night, as Elna settled into bed, her phone buzzed. A single message. "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." Her blood ran cold. She sat upright, scanning the dimly lit room. The silence felt heavier now, as if someone was watching. For the first time since arriving in Riyadh, real fear gripped her. And deep down she knew this was only the beginning. The walls of the palace held their secrets well, their grandeur masking the quiet turmoil brewing within. Elna had learned this in the short time she had been here. Every hallway she walked through, every carefully spoken word, and every lingering glance told her that she was in a place where appearances mattered more than truth. But truth had a way of forcing itself to the surface. The message she had received the night before still haunted her. "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." It had been a warning. But from whom? She clutched her Bible tightly in her hands, seeking comfort in the Word as she sat in the garden where she often prayed. The verse from Psalm 34:17 came to her heart like a whisper from above. "The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles." And yet, her troubles only seemed to be growing. Khalid wasn't sure when it started. Perhaps it was the first time he saw Elna kneeling in the garden, whispering words to a God he had long since dismissed. Or the moment he caught her laughing softly with Malik and Zayd, the sound so foreign in the palace that it made him pause in his tracks. She was different from anyone he had ever known. He had married her out of necessity, expecting her to be just another complication in his life, another pawn in the political game he had been forced to play since birth. But Elna had proven to be neither a burden nor a threat. Instead, she was a mystery, a woman of quiet strength, a woman of faith. And against his better judgment, Khalid found himself drawn to her. More than once, he caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the way she tucked a stray braid behind her ear as she read in the library, the way her lips moved in silent prayer when she thought no one was paying attention, the way her eyes softened whenever she looked at his children. He was a man of reason, a leader who made decisions based on strategy, not emotion, and yet something inside him was changing. Why do I want to see her smile? Why do I feel an unfamiliar ache when she looks at me and then looks away? He had been careful to keep his distance, reminding himself that this marriage was nothing more than a political move. But Elna was making that increasingly difficult. Elna didn't know when the doubt had started to creep in. For years, she had believed that Luandil was her future. She had fought for him, defended him, sacrificed for him. But what if she had been wrong? What if it had never been love, but merely attachment? Since arriving in Riyadh, she had been forced to see things more clearly. She had always thought of Luandile as her partner, but had he ever truly supported her? Had he ever respected her faith? Had he ever encouraged her dreams? Or had he only wanted her to fit into his? And then there was Khalid, a man so different from Luandil, yet just as frustrating. Reserved, guarded, impossibly difficult to read. But sometimes when she caught him watching her, there was something in his eyes that she couldn't ignore, something that made her heart stutter. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. This was not a love story. This was survival. And yet, the battle in her heart was growing fiercer by the day. The night air was thick with tension. Khalid sat in the grand dining hall. His advisors gathered around him. The conversation was laced with politics, alliances, and negotiations. He barely tasted the food on his plate, his mind elsewhere. And then a sharp pain shot through his stomach. He gasped, his vision blurring as the world around him tilted. Chaos erupted. Voices shouted. Chairs scraped against the floor. Elna heard the commotion from across the palace. She was reading in her chambers when a servant burst in, breathless. "Sheikh Khalid, he's been poisoned!" The book slipped from her hands. Without thinking, she ran. When she reached the hall, Khalid was slumped in his chair, his skin pale, his breath labored. "Someone get a doctor!" a voice yelled. Elna dropped to her knees beside him. "Elna!" His voice was hoarse, weak. Tears stung her eyes. "You're going to be okay." But she didn't know if that was true. She pressed her hands over his, squeezing tightly. "God, please," she whispered. She didn't know if Khalid believed in prayer, but she did. And right now, that was all that mattered. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. Over and over she repeated the words, her heart crying out to the one who had never failed her. And then, a breath, a shift. Khalid's eyelids fluttered, his breathing slowing. Color returned to his face, and though he was still weak, the danger had passed. The doctor arrived moments later, stunned by his rapid recovery. Elna knew God had answered. And Khalid? For the first time in years, he began to wonder if he had been wrong about faith all along. Days passed. Khalid remained in the palace, recovering under Elna's watchful eye. He still didn't speak of what had happened that night, but Elna knew it had shaken him. Something had shifted between them. And then, just as one storm had calmed, another arrived. Elna received a call from an old friend back home. "Elna," the voice on the other end hesitated. "I don't know how to tell you this, but you need to know the truth about Luandil." Her heart pounded. "What do you mean?" A pause, then, "He's been seeing someone else for months." Silence. A coldness spread through Elna's chest. "No," she whispered, "that's not true." But even as she said it, she knew. She had been manipulated, lied to, made to feel guilty for leaving a man who had never been faithful to her. She sank onto the edge of her bed, numb. Everything she had believed about Luandil, about their relationship, had been a lie. And in that moment, she realized something else. She wasn't mourning the loss of love. She was mourning the loss of an illusion. Luandili had never been her future. And maybe, just maybe, she'd been meant to walk this path all along. As the weight of betrayal settled over her, a knock sounded at her door. She wiped her tears quickly. "Come in." Khalid stepped inside. His gaze searched hers. "Are you okay?" Elna hesitated. Then for the first time she told him the truth. "No." Khalid didn't move closer, didn't speak. But in his eyes she saw something unexpected. Understanding. And for the first time since she had arrived in this palace, Elna felt something shift inside her heart. A battle had been waged within her, and she had finally won. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. Khalid had come to check on her, but neither of them had expected the moment to stretch out like this. Elna swallowed, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. She had just admitted her vulnerability, something she rarely did. Yet Khalid hadn't looked away. He hadn't dismissed her pain or told her to be strong. He had simply stayed, and somehow that meant everything. "Khalid," she began, but she hesitated. "Yes?" His voice was softer than usual, laced with something she couldn't quite name. Elna exhaled. She never finished the sentence. Because in the next moment, Khalid stepped closer, his eyes searching hers as if looking for permission. And then, before she could second-guess it, before she could remind herself that this marriage was nothing but a contract, he leaned in. A kiss. Soft, unexpected. A whisper of something neither of them had dared to acknowledge until now. It lasted only a heartbeat before he pulled back, his expression unreadable. "I shouldn't have done that," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Elna could still feel the warmth of his lips against hers, the weight of something shifting between them. We should talk," she said breathlessly. "Not now," Khalid said, shaking his head. "Not until I know you're safe." His words jolted her back to reality. The poison, the assassination attempt, the warning message she had received. "Do you know who tried to kill you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not yet, Khalid admitted, but I will. His tone was dark, full of unspoken promises. Elna could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a political threat anymore. This was personal. Tomorrow, he continued, I'm launching a full investigation. No one will get away with this. She nodded, understanding that their moment, whatever it had been, would have to wait. But as Khalid turned to leave, he hesitated at the door. Elna, he said, glancing back at her. Yes? His eyes lingered on her lips before meeting her gaze again. Good night. And then he was gone, leaving Elna breathless, confused, and undeniably changed. Chapter 5. The Cost of Truth. The day had begun like any other in the palace, but it quickly unraveled into a nightmare. Elna had just finished reading to Malik and Zayd in the garden when the heavy sound of approaching boots shattered the peaceful moment. A group of royal guards, led by the formidable General Rahim, stormed toward her. Their faces were unreadable, but their presence alone was enough to make her stomach twist. Elna Mthembu, General Rahim's deep voice rang out, by order of His Highness, Sheikh Khalid al-Faisal, you are under arrest. Elna's breath caught. What? She rose slowly, glancing between the children and the guards. This has to be a mistake. The boys clung to her. No, don't take her, Malik cried, wrapping his small arms around her waist. Zayd, the quieter of the two, looked at the guards with an intensity beyond his years. Baba won't allow this, he said, his voice laced with the fierce confidence only a child could have. But the guards did not waver. Sheikh Khalid has personally ordered this, Rahim said. Step forward, Miss Mthembu. Elna's heart pounded. Khalid had ordered this. It made no sense. After everything, after the tenderness that had grown between them, after the stolen kiss they had shared, why would he turn on her? I don't understand, she whispered. What have I done? General Rahim's expression remained cold. You are being investigated for conspiring against His Highness. We have evidence linking you to the poisoning attempt. Elna's blood ran cold. That's impossible. I would never. You will have your chance to speak in due time, Rahim cut in. For now, you must come with us. Tears welled in Malik's eyes. Please, Baba won't let this happen, he said again, his small voice breaking. Elna knelt, cupping the boy's face. I promise everything will be okay, but the words felt hollow. Before she could say more, strong hands seized her arms and pulled her away from the children's grasp. The last thing she saw before she was dragged inside was their tear-streaked faces. Khalid stood in the grand hall, his jaw clenched as his advisors argued. The accusations against Elna had shaken the palace, and his council demanded swift action. She must be punished, Your Highness, one of his ministers said. The people are already whispering that she was behind the assassination attempt. If you do not act, they will assume you are weak. Khalid's fingers curled into fists. Elna had nothing to do with the poisoning. And yet, Rahim interjected, someone within your household orchestrated it. The people need a scapegoat, and a foreign woman, an outsider, makes for the perfect suspect. Khalid's heart pounded with frustration. Elna is innocent. I know she is. But the pressure was mounting. If he showed her favor, his enemies would exploit it. His position as ruler would be threatened. He turned away from his council, staring out the massive window overlooking the city. Below, the streets bustled with life that he had sworn to protect. But at what cost? His mind flashed back to Elna. Her unwavering faith, her kindness toward his children, the way her presence had softened something inside him that he had long believed was unbreakable. But now she was in a prison cell because of him. Later that night, unable to rest, Khalid found himself in Elna's quarters. The room still carried her presence, the faint scent of vanilla, the neatly arranged books on the bedside table. His fingers traced over one of them, pausing when he saw a small, leather-bound book tucked beneath a scarf. Curious, he pulled it out. A Bible. Khalid frowned, flipping through the delicate pages. It was worn from use, filled with notes and highlighted verses. His gaze landed on one that had been underlined multiple times. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. Something deep within him stirred. Elna had spoken of her faith before, but he had dismissed it. He had believed that faith was for the weak, for those who needed something to cling to. But now he wasn't so sure. If Elna could still hold on to her faith, even in the face of betrayal and imprisonment, then maybe there was something to it after all. He exhaled slowly, shutting the book. He needed to find a way to save her. Elna sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, her knees drawn to her chest. The air smelled of damp stone, and the only sound was the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor. She had prayed until her voice was hoarse, but fear still gripped her. "Lord, I don't understand. Why is this happening? I thought you brought me here for a reason." Tears welled in her eyes. She had survived so much, leaving South Africa, breaking free from Luandele's manipulation, navigating the dangerous world of the palace. But now she felt utterly abandoned. A shuffling sound outside her cell made her look up. The small barred window in the door slid open, and a plate of food was pushed inside. She stared at it blankly. She had no appetite. As she turned away, a small slip of paper caught her eye beneath the plate. Her heart pounded as she picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. "The execution will be announced tomorrow. If you want to live, confess." The room spun around her. She sank against the wall, clutching the note in her hand. "God help me." The next day, the grand hall was filled with murmurs as Khalid stood before his people. The weight of the decision pressed on him like never before. He glanced at his advisors, all of whom were watching him expectantly. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he spoke. "Elna Mthembu," he said, "has been accused of conspiracy against the crown." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "As ruler, I am sworn to uphold justice," Khalid continued. He hesitated, gripping the edge of the podium. The words felt like poison in his mouth. "And therefore, unless she confesses her crimes, her execution will proceed." Gasps filled the hall. From the corner of his eye, he saw Malik and Zaid standing with their governess. Malik's face was pale, and Zaid looked on the verge of tears. Khalid's chest tightened. Had he just sealed Elna's fate? As the crowd whispered among themselves, he turned away, his expression unreadable. But inside, his heart was at war. He had never doubted himself before. But for the first time in his life, Sheikh Khalid al-Faisal was questioning everything. Khalid's hands trembled as he returned to his chambers. His heart pounded, the weight of his announcement pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. He had spoken the words, but they felt like a betrayal, not just of Elna, but of himself. He turned to the small wooden box on his desk, lifting the lid with hesitation. Inside, nestled among other documents, was the small, leather-bound Bible he had taken from Elna's room. He had intended to return it, but instead he found himself opening it night after night, drawn to the unfamiliar words within. He traced a verse Elna had underlined. "The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles." Psalm 34:17. Would her God deliver her now? A knock on his door snapped him from his thoughts. General Rahim stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Your Highness, there has been new information." Khalid straightened. "Go on." Rahim hesitated. "A witness has come forward claiming that Elna had nothing to do with the poisoning. They say the real traitor is still within the palace." Khalid's pulse quickened. "Who is this witness?" Rahim exhaled. "A servant, but they refuse to speak openly. They fear for their life." Khalid's mind raced. This was his chance, his way to save Elna. But it wasn't enough. He needed proof, something undeniable. He closed the Bible, slipping it back into the box as he turned to Rahim. "Find this witness. Offer them protection." Rahim nodded but hesitated. "And Elna?" Khalid's jaw clenched. He could not, would not let her die. "I will handle it," he said firmly. As Rahim left, Khalid exhaled slowly. The answer was becoming clear. He would risk everything to uncover the truth. And to save Elna. The weight of the impending execution loomed over the palace like a dark cloud. The air was thick with tension, every guard on high alert, and whispers of Elna's supposed betrayal circulated among the palace staff. Khalid had remained silent throughout the day, his face a mask of unreadable calm. But inside, a storm raged. That night, as the moon cast silver streaks over the desert horizon, Khalid made his decision. He would not let Elna die. Khalid moved swiftly through the dim corridors of the palace, his gut tightening with every step. He had spent the past few nights reading Elna's Bible in secret, drawn to the words that stirred something deep inside him. The passage from John 8:32 repeated in his mind, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." The truth. Khalid had spent his entire life believing his power, his rule, and his traditions were all that mattered. But now he was beginning to see the cracks in everything he once stood for. The woman sitting in the cold, damp cell beneath his feet was innocent. His heart knew it before his mind did. He reached the dungeon entrance, where 2 guards stood post. "Leave us," he commanded. They hesitated. Now, at the weight of his authority, they bowed and stepped aside. Khalid entered the cell and found Elna huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. At the sight of him, her weary eyes widened with a mixture of fear and hope. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Khalid's gaze softened, and for the first time he allowed himself to admit the truth, "To set you free." Her lips parted in disbelief, but there was no time for explanations. He pulled a long cloak from under his arm and handed it to her. "Put this on. We must go. Now." Elna hesitated, but when she saw the urgency in his face, she obeyed. As she draped the cloak over herself, Khalid led her out, taking a hidden route through the servant quarters. His heart pounded. If they were caught, not even his title could save them. They rode hard into the desert, the cool night air whipping past them. The city lights disappeared behind them, replaced by endless dunes of golden sand bathed in moonlight. After hours of travel, Khalid finally brought the horse to a stop near an abandoned stone shelter. "We will rest here," he said, dismounting. Elna slid off the horse, exhaustion evident in her posture. She wrapped her arms around herself and exhaled shakily. "I still can't believe this is happening." Khalid studied her for a long moment. "Neither can I." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, without thinking, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. Elna's breath hitched. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and for the first time, Khalid felt completely vulnerable. He had been drawn to her before, but now, under the stars, away from the palace, there were no titles, no politics, only a man and a woman caught in something far greater than either of them could explain. "Elna," his voice was hoarse. She looked up at him, eyes searching. "What is this?" Khalid swallowed hard. He knew what she was asking. Was this just desperation, a fleeting attachment in the midst of chaos? Or was it something more? Instead of answering, he leaned in. Elna didn't pull away. Their lips met, and the world around them faded. Unlike their first kiss, which had been born of uncertainty and fear, this one was slow, deep, and consuming. Khalid's hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer as heat surged between them. Elna's hands rested against his chest, her heart pounding as she let herself surrender to the moment. But just as quickly as it started, Khalid pulled back, breathing heavily. "Elna," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "This, whatever this is, it cannot be ignored." She closed her eyes. "I know." And yet neither of them spoke further. The reality of their situation was too complex, too dangerous. For now, it was enough that they had this moment. As dawn broke over the desert, Khalid sat on the edge of the stone shelter, staring at the horizon. He held Elna's Bible in his hands, flipping through the worn pages. She stirred awake and found him lost in thought. "You're reading it." Khalid looked up, hesitating for only a moment before nodding. "Yes." A pause. "I don't understand everything," he admitted, "but I can't deny that there is something different about these words." Elna sat beside him, her presence warm and familiar. "The truth is calling you," she said softly. Khalid exhaled. I never thought I would question what I've always believed, but ever since I met you, I see things differently." Elna reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "God is reaching out to you, Khalid. He has a plan for you." He wanted to believe that. More than anything, he wanted to believe that. Their peace was short-lived. The sound of galloping hooves shattered the morning calm. Khalid jumped to his feet, immediately recognizing the riders approaching. His heart sank. One of his most trusted advisors, Hassan, was leading them. Hassan dismounted, his face tight with regret. "Your Highness," he said, voice low, "you must surrender." Khalid clenched his jaw. "You betrayed me. I had no choice. If I did not lead them here, someone else would have." The soldiers behind Hassan drew their weapons. Elna grabbed Khalid's arm. "We have to run." But it was too late. Within seconds, they were surrounded. Khalid's hand tightened into a fist. He would die before he let them take Elna. Hassan sighed. "Don't fight, Your Highness, it's over." Khalid turned to Elna, his heart breaking. "I'm sorry." She shook her head, her grip on him firm. "No, not like this." The soldiers moved forward. And then Khalid did something he never thought he would do. He lifted his head toward the heavens, and for the first time spoke words foreign yet familiar. "Jesus, help us." The moment the words left his lips, a strange hush fell over the soldiers. They exchanged uncertain glances, as if suddenly unsure of their orders. Hassan's eyes widened. "What did you just say?" Khalid swallowed, his heart pounding. "You heard me." Elna clutched his hand, her own breath caught in disbelief. Had Khalid just prayed? The tension in the air was electric. The soldiers hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. And in that brief moment of uncertainty, Elna realized God was moving. A gust of wind howled through the desert, whipping up a fierce sandstorm. The guards shielded their faces, momentarily blinded. Elna felt Khalid squeeze her hand. "Run," he whispered. And without hesitation, they sprinted into the storm. Behind them, the shouts of the soldiers were drowned by the roaring wind. Khalid's whispered prayer echoed in Elna's heart. Had God truly answered? She didn't know. But one thing was certain, this was far from over. The desert wind howled, whipping sand into violent swirls that clouded their vision. Khalid kept a firm grip on Elna's hand as they ran, their feet sinking into the shifting dunes with each frantic step. The guards' voices grew distant behind them, lost in the storm's fury. "Elna, stay close!" Khalid shouted over the roaring wind. She could barely see him, his figure a shadow in the swirling sand, but she trusted his grip, strong, unwavering. They pressed forward blindly, hoping the storm would serve as their refuge. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the wind began to settle. The air cleared enough for them to glimpse their surroundings. The vast emptiness of the desert stretched endlessly before them, but they were no longer alone. A caravan of riders emerged from the haze. Khalid's heart pounded. Were they allies or another threat? The lead rider pulled back his scarf, revealing a weathered face with piercing eyes. It was Omar, an old friend of Khalid's late father and a respected Bedouin chieftain. "Khalid!" Omar's voice carried the weight of astonishment. "By Allah, what are you doing here?" Khalid exhaled in relief. "No time to explain, we need help." Omar studied them for a brief moment, his gaze lingering on Elna's disheveled appearance. Then, with a nod, he motioned to his men. "Come with us." Under the cover of night, the caravan rode back toward the palace, using the lesser-known trade routes to avoid patrols. Khalid sat behind Elna on horseback, his arms around her waist as they moved swiftly through the dunes. Neither of them spoke, but the tension between them was undeniable. Khalid's mind was racing. Had he truly called upon Jesus back in the desert? The words had left his lips instinctively, yet something had shifted. He had felt it, the unseen power of a name he was only beginning to understand. Elna too was lost in thought. Khalid had risked everything for her, and that kiss, it had been real, unguarded, impossible to forget. By the time they reached the outskirts of the palace, Khalid's resolve had hardened. He could not hide from this any longer. He had to face the truth. Omar's men stopped a safe distance away. "You can slip in through the servants' gate," Omar advised. "But be warned, the council is not pleased with you, Khalid." Khalid nodded grimly. I expected as much. Omar hesitated, then placed a hand on Khalid's shoulder. Your father was a great man. Do not let fear silence you. With those parting words, Omar and his men disappeared into the desert, leaving Khalid and Elna standing at the palace's shadowed entrance. We're not safe yet, Khalid murmured. Elna turned to him, her eyes searching his. Neither are you. He exhaled. I know. And with that, they stepped forward, into the lion's den, into the unknown, into the unfolding of destiny itself. Keeping to the shadows, Khalid led Elna through the narrow servants' passage, his movements swift and precise. He knew every hidden corridor, every blind spot where the guards wouldn't look. They pressed against the cool stone walls as a pair of sentries passed by, their voices low in discussion. Elna held her breath, her pulse thundering in her ears. When the footsteps faded, Khalid grasped her hand and pulled her forward. Step by step, they weaved through the palace's labyrinthine hallways until they reached Khalid's private quarters. Only then did he release a breath of relief. They had made it, but for how long? The tension in the palace was palpable. The very air seemed to crackle with uncertainty as Khalid and Elna settled back into the royal residence. Though they had escaped death in the desert, their challenges were far from over. Khalid spent hours poring over legal documents, seeking a way to maintain his rule without compromising his newfound faith. His advisors, now wary of his unpredictable decisions, were growing restless. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, he came across an ancient clause buried deep within the kingdom's legal framework. His heartbeat quickened as he read the words over and over again, ensuring he was not mistaken. If the reigning Sheikh enters into a marriage based on true love and not political alliance, the council shall have no power to remove him, for love is the highest form of loyalty. Khalid exhaled sharply. Could this be the answer? Could his feelings for Elna, real and undeniable, be the very thing that secured his throne? He ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. But would Elna even agree to such a thing? As dawn broke, Khalid made his way to the grand hall where his advisors had gathered, their expressions unreadable. He had called for an emergency session, one that would alter the course of the kingdom forever. Taking his seat at the head of the long table, he let silence settle before speaking. I have made a decision, he announced, his voice steady. I will not renounce my faith in Christ. The room erupted in hushed murmurs. Some gasped, others exchanged worried glances. You are risking everything, one of the elders warned. The people will not stand for this. Khalid met his gaze without flinching. The people deserve a leader who rules with truth. I will not deny what has changed my heart. Another advisor leaned forward, voice low and tense. Then they will demand your removal. A small smile tugged at Khalid's lips. Not if I marry for love. Silence stretched through the room. He allowed the weight of his words to settle before continuing. There exists a clause, one that permits a ruler to maintain his throne if he marries out of genuine love rather than political gain. Eyes widened. But who? Another advisor dared to ask. Who would you choose? Khalid did not hesitate. His mind had already made the decision before his heart had fully admitted it. Elna. Elna stood by the window of her chamber, looking out at the sprawling cityscape of Riyadh. The sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, but her heart was conflicted. She had grown to love Khalid, not just for his strength, but for the way he had begun to change, the way he looked at Malik and Zaid with gentleness, the way he had risked everything to save her. But what of her home? South Africa? And then there was Lwandile. Her stomach twisted at the thought of him. The man she had once planned to spend her life with had proven himself manipulative, selfish, and faithless. Just as she turned away from the window, a knock sounded at her door. Khalid entered, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. She nodded, bracing herself. I want you to stay, he said simply. Not out of obligation, but because you belong here, with me, with the children. Tears pricked at her eyes. Khalid. He took a step closer. I have fallen in love with you, Elna, and I believe you love me too. She let out a shaky breath, unable to deny the truth of his words. But before she could respond, the door flung open and a shadowy figure stepped inside. Elna, the man said grimly, you need to know something. She stiffened as recognition dawned. It was one of her father's old business associates. What is it? She asked warily. His next word sent a chill down her spine. Lwandile has taken control of your family's assets. He's waiting for you to return to South Africa so he can control you too. A stunned silence filled the room, and just like that, Elna's past came crashing into her present. Her decision had just become even more complicated. Elna's breath hitched at the revelation, but instead of panic, a strange sense of clarity washed over her. The last remaining illusions she had about Lwandile crumbled like dust. He hadn't just manipulated her. He had been actively preparing for a life without her, while still trying to keep her under his control. Khalid's jaw tightened. How much has he taken? He asked, his protective instincts kicking in. The man sighed. Everything your father left behind. The company, the estates, the investments. Legally, it all still belongs to your family. But Lwandile has positioned himself as the rightful heir. Elna exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of a nearby chair. I already know he's been seeing someone else for the past 5 months, she said quietly. He thinks he still has power over me, but he doesn't. Khalid's gaze snapped to her, searching her face. You knew? She nodded. I wasn't sure at first, but I had my suspicions. Then I found out the truth just before our wedding. It hurt, but it also set me free. Khalid studied her, admiration flickering in his dark eyes. And now, she straightened her shoulders, now I have no doubts about him. He lost his hold over me the moment he chose to betray me. He's the one grasping at control, not me. The business associate cleared his throat. He's expecting you to come back and beg for what's rightfully yours. Elna let out a humorless chuckle. Then he's in for a surprise. Khalid stepped closer, his presence grounding her. If you go back, you'll be walking into his trap, he warned. But if you stay, you have a new beginning here. With me. She met his gaze, the weight of his words settling deep in her heart. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. And she knew exactly what she wanted. The palace was unusually quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that made your skin prickle with unseen danger. Elna sat in the royal garden, watching the sunset paint streaks of orange and gold across the sky. The beauty of it felt almost cruel, as if the heavens had no idea that by sunrise everything could change. She had overheard the whispers among the guards. The coup was coming. Khalid's enemies were moving faster than expected. Her heart ached for him. He had been carrying the weight of the entire kingdom on his shoulders, standing firm against those who wanted to strip him of power. And now they were closing in. Elna! She turned at the sound of his voice. Khalid stood in the archway, his robe slightly disheveled, his dark eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. He looked at her for a long moment before walking toward her. I needed to see you, he admitted, his voice unusually soft. She swallowed. I was waiting for you. He exhaled heavily and sat beside her on the stone bench. I don't know what will happen tonight. Elna nodded. Neither do I. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, but beneath it there was something else. Something neither of them had dared to name. Finally, Khalid turned to her. I can face anything, but I can't bear the thought of you getting hurt. Elna felt her heart pound. Khalid, listen to me, he interrupted. I know I don't deserve you. I know I have no right to ask you to stay. He hesitated, his voice dropping lower. But I don't want to lose you. The words hung in the air. She inhaled sharply. You won't lose me. A flicker of something crossed his face. Relief, hesitation, longing. Then, before she could think, before either of them could stop it, he reached for her, and she let him. His lips met hers in a kiss that stole the breath from her lungs. It wasn't rushed or desperate, but it was intense, like a confession, a promise, a plea. She melted into him, her fingers clutching the fabric of his robe as he deepened the kiss. His touch was careful, reverent, as if he was afraid she would disappear. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Khalid rested his forehead against hers. "Elna," she cupped his face. "We will face this together." His jaw clenched. "If anything happens..." She shook her head. "Don't." A long silence stretched between them before he finally whispered, "I love you." Elna felt her eyes sting. "Say it again." His lips brushed her temple. "I love you." She smiled through the tears, threatening to fall. "I love you too." The weight of the moment settled between them, but before they could speak again, a frantic knock echoed through the garden. "Your Highness." Khalid stiffened. "What is it?" The guard's voice was tense. "They're here." The attack came with brutal efficiency. The outer gates fell within minutes, and the palace halls turned into a war zone. Khalid's loyal guards fought, but they were outnumbered. "Elna, go!" Khalid ordered, drawing his sword. "I won't leave you!" "Elna!" He grabbed her arms, his expression desperate. "You have to survive this. If they take you, they will use you against me." Tears blurred her vision. "I don't care about any of that. I care about you." Khalid exhaled shakily, cupping her face. "I need you to live." A group of soldiers burst into the corridor. Khalid's grip tightened. "Run!" Elna hesitated, but then, with one last glance, she turned and fled. The flight to South Africa was a blur. One moment she was fighting to stay by Khalid's side. The next, she was in a cold, unfamiliar hotel room in Johannesburg. Everything felt hollow. Khalid was gone. The kingdom had fallen. She sat on the bed, staring at the Bible in her lap. She had prayed so hard, begged God to intervene. Had he... Her phone buzzed. Her hands trembled as she opened the message. "The kingdom has fallen. Khalid is missing." Missing, not dead, not imprisoned. Missing! Elna clenched her fists. She wouldn't accept this. She dropped to her knees, gripping the Bible. "God, I don't know where he is, but you do. You promised to answer when we call. So I'm calling. Show me what to do." Tears slipped down her face, but her spirit was steady. She would not give up. She would find him, and she would bring him home. The cold stone floor of the prison cell bit into Khalid's knees, but he barely noticed. His hands were bound, his body bruised, but he was alive. He didn't know why they hadn't killed him. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he turned to see an old prisoner staring at him. "You're the Sheikh," the man said. Khalid didn't respond. The old man tilted his head. "And yet you kneel." Khalid swallowed hard. "I don't know what else to do." A pause, then quietly, "Are you praying?" Khalid exhaled. "I think so." His mind went to Elna, to the way she always whispered to her God, to the way she had called his name when things seemed impossible. And so, for the first time in his life, Khalid closed his eyes and whispered, "God, if you can hear me, help me." The words felt foreign, but something about them felt right. And in the silence that followed, for the first time since he had been captured, he felt hope. Khalid moved through the underground tunnels beneath Riyadh with swift precision. The air was damp, the flickering torchlight casting eerie shadows on the ancient stone walls. His body ached from weeks of captivity, but the adrenaline of freedom surged through him. The escape had been orchestrated by Malik, his most trusted general, along with a handful of loyal allies who had risked everything to rescue him. They had bribed the right guards, used forged documents, and now, against all odds, Khalid was free. But he was not safe, not yet. "We have a small window before they realize you're gone," Malik whispered as they reached the tunnel's exit. "From here, we'll get you to the desert, and then back to the city under a new identity." Khalid exhaled sharply. "And then what?" "Then you take back what is yours." Khalid nodded. He had been broken, humiliated, and left for dead, but he had also learned something in that prison cell, something he never imagined he would. He had prayed, not just once, not just in desperation, but in surrender. He had called out to Elna's God, and somehow he had felt something shift in his heart. Now, as he prepared to reclaim his throne, he knew one thing for certain: he would not rule as the man he once was. In Johannesburg, Elna sat on the balcony of her childhood home, staring at the city lights stretching endlessly before her. She should have felt at peace here. This was home, this was where she belonged. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Khalid's absence was a constant ache in her chest. The kiss they had shared, his whispered confessions of love, those moments played in her mind over and over again. She had tried to move on, to focus on rebuilding her life, but nothing felt the same. To make matters worse, she had returned to a family in crisis. Lwandile had taken full control of the family business, manipulating contracts and making decisions without consulting her. "You don't need to concern yourself with business matters," he had told her smugly. "You've been gone too long." But Elna wasn't the same woman who had once been blindly loyal to him. She knew who he truly was, and she knew his biggest secret. She had discovered the truth. Lwandile had been seeing someone else for 5 months, all while pretending to still have a claim on her. The old Elna would have confronted him in rage. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She simply stepped back, handed over her shares to her mother, and walked away. She was done being manipulated. But she wasn't done waiting on God. One Sunday morning, she sat in church, head bowed, heart heavy. "God, I need to hear from you. I need to know what's next." And then her phone vibrated. She almost ignored it, but something told her to look. Her breath caught in her throat. The message was short. "He's alive. Khalid is alive." The moment Elna stepped out of church, her phone rang again. She answered without hesitation. "Hello?" The voice on the other end sent a shiver down her spine. "Elna." "Khalid." Her knees nearly buckled. "Khalid, where are you? How are you?" "I'm free," he interrupted, "and I need to see you." Tears streamed down her face. I love you," he said urgently. "I loved you before they took me. I loved you every moment I was in that prison, and I love you now. I don't care about the throne. I don't care about politics. I only care about you." Elna covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "I want to build a life with you," Khalid continued, "not because of duty, not because of a kingdom, but because you are the woman I want to spend my life with." Elna closed her eyes. "Then come to me." "I already am." The arrival terminal at Johannesburg International Airport was buzzing with travelers, but Elna barely noticed anyone else. She stood frozen in place, heart pounding, hands trembling, and then she saw him. Khalid stepped through the crowd, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The moment their eyes met, everything else faded. She ran. She didn't care who was watching. She didn't care about anything except reaching him. Khalid caught her in his arms, holding her tightly against him. Elna sobbed into his chest, gripping his shirt as if letting go would make him disappear. "You're really here," she whispered. "I told you I would come for you." They stood there, wrapped in each other, as the world moved around them. Khalid pulled back just enough to cup her face. "Come with me, Elna. Let's start over. Not as a king and a woman caught in a political mess, but as a man and a woman in love." Elna smiled through her tears. "Yes." And then he kissed her. This kiss wasn't desperate. It wasn't stolen in the middle of chaos. It was a promise, a beginning. That night, under the African sky, Khalid took Elna's hands in his. "I don't have a kingdom to offer you right now," he admitted. "I don't even know what the future holds, but I know I want you by my side no matter what happens." Elna looked up at him, her heart full. "I don't want a kingdom," she whispered. "I want you." Khalid exhaled shakily, then sank to one knee. "I don't have a ring," he said, "but I have my heart, and I want to give it to you completely. Will you marry me?" Tears slid down Elna's face. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes. He stood, gathering her into his arms once more. And under the stars, their journey truly began. The private jet soared over the Arabian Peninsula, the vast desert stretching endlessly beneath them. Khalid sat across from Elna, his fingers interlocked with hers. He had barely let go of her hand since they left South Africa, as if he feared losing her again. Elna studied him, the man who had once been a ruler bound by duty, now transformed into a man of faith. There was something different in his eyes, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "Khalid," she murmured, "are you ready for this?" He exhaled slowly. I don't know what's waiting for us in Riyadh, but I do know this. I won't fight for the throne the way I used to. If God has willed it to be mine, then he will make a way. Elna squeezed his hand. Then let's trust him. They arrived in Riyadh under the cover of night. The city was tense. News of Khalid's escape had spread, and his enemies were scrambling to maintain control. Malik, along with a group of loyalists, met them at a hidden safe house. The council is divided, Malik reported. Some still believe you are the rightful ruler, but others have been bought off. They've placed a temporary leader in your seat, but the people are restless. They never truly accepted him. Khalid's jaw tightened. Then we show them the truth. The next morning he walked into the Grand Palace, not as a fallen king seeking revenge, but as a leader prepared to fight with righteousness. His presence alone sent a shockwave through the court. Gasps echoed in the marble halls as guards and advisors turned to face him. The false ruler, Sheikh Omar, stood frozen at the throne, his face pale. Khalid? Khalid took a deep breath. The people did not choose you. You forced your way onto this throne through corruption and fear. Omar straightened, regaining his composure. You have no power here anymore. Khalid's voice rang clear. If that is true, then let the people decide. The doors of the palace burst open, and the crowds surged in, men and women who had suffered under Omar's rule, who had heard the whispers of Khalid's survival, who longed for a leader with integrity. The moment the people saw Khalid, a wave of cheers erupted. He's back! Long live Khalid! Omar's face darkened as he saw the shift. The guards who had sworn loyalty to him began stepping away, their hands resting hesitantly on their weapons. Malik moved beside Khalid. We don't need bloodshed. Let the council vote again. Omar had no choice. The vote was swift, and this time there was no bribery, no coercion. The council reinstated Khalid as king. Justice had prevailed. The palace, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now overflowed with joy. News of Khalid's reinstatement as king had spread across the kingdom, and with it came an even greater announcement, his wedding to Elna. For the first time in decades, the grand courtyard of the palace was transformed into a place of celebration. Golden lanterns lined the paths, their soft glow illuminating the faces of nobles and commoners alike. Silk draperies cascaded from marble pillars, and the scent of frankincense and jasmine filled the air. Khalid stood at the altar dressed in a regal white robe, embroidered with intricate gold patterns. He had never been a man prone to nervousness, but tonight his hands trembled slightly. Not out of fear, but out of reverence for the moment. Malik and Zayd stood beside him, beaming with pride. "Father, you look different," Zayd whispered. Malik smirked. "He's in love." Khalid chuckled, shaking his head. "You two are impossible." But before they could tease him further, the music changed. A hush fell over the crowd. Then she appeared. Elna walked toward him, a vision of grace. Her gown, a blend of South African and Arabian tradition, shimmered in the candlelight. White fabric with delicate gold accents clung to her form, and a sheer veil framed her face. Her eyes, filled with love and unwavering certainty, met his. Khalid could barely breathe. He had seen her in moments of strength, in times of sorrow, in battles both physical and spiritual. But tonight, she was his bride. When she reached him, he took her hands in his. "Are you ready for this?" she whispered. He smiled. "With you, always." The ceremony was unlike any the kingdom had ever seen. It was not just a political union, but a sacred covenant before God. Khalid, once a man who ruled by tradition, now stood openly declaring his faith. When it came time for their vows, he spoke first. "Elna," he said, his voice steady, "I never knew what love truly was until you showed me. You led me to faith when I was lost. You challenged me to seek the truth. And now I stand here before God, before my people, and before you, to vow my life to you. Not as a ruler, but as a man who has been redeemed." Elna's eyes shimmered with tears. "Khalid, I came to this land as a stranger. I fought battles I never imagined I would face. But in the midst of it all, God showed me something greater. He showed me you. You are not just the man I love, but the man I will stand beside in faith, in love, and in all that is to come." A sacred silence followed. Then the officiant declared, "By the grace of God, and before these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Khalid cupped Elna's face, his thumb brushing her cheek before he kissed her, deeply, reverently, with all the love he had held in his heart. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Fireworks lit up the sky. Drums and flutes filled the air. People danced, feasted, and rejoiced, not just for their king's wedding, but for the new era that had begun. That night, as Khalid and Elna stood on the palace balcony, watching the festivities below, he pulled her close. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. Elna nodded. "Yes, a new beginning." And as they looked out over their kingdom, they knew that the past was behind them. Their future, now led by faith and love, had only just begun. The moment Khalid reclaimed the throne, a change swept through Riyadh. It wasn't just political, it was spiritual. For years, the kingdom had been bound by traditions, some of which had strangled the people's hunger for truth. But now, there was an awakening. People began to gather in secret meetings, hungry for the word of God. Whispers of prayer gatherings in the desert spread through the city. Business leaders began seeking integrity over corruption. Families once torn apart by political strife started to reconcile. And at the center of it all was Khalid and Elna. Khalid, once indifferent to faith, now led with humility. Though he didn't have all the answers, he sought wisdom, not just from his advisors, but from God. One evening, he and Elna walked through the palace gardens. The sound of distant worship echoed from a hidden gathering nearby. Elna turned to him. "Did you ever imagine this?" Khalid shook his head. "Never, but God is doing something new, and I want to be part of it." She smiled. "We already are." In the streets, people spoke of miracles, of lives transformed, of hardened hearts turning to Christ. Even within the palace, servants and officials whispered of dreams and visions, of signs they could not explain. Khalid looked out over the city, watching as lanterns flickered in the night, each one a symbol of a heart awakening to faith. A new kingdom had risen not through war, but through surrender. Surrender to a greater king. With Elna's hand in his, he whispered, "The past is behind us. There's no going back." She nodded, her voice soft but resolute, "Only forward." And as they stood in the heart of a transformed kingdom, the words of the prophet came to life. "Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." Isaiah 43:18-19.